Morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody around the world across the 7 continents and sea. My name is Juan. I'm the host of the Psych Life Podcast, and today we have a special guest, Kelsey Straatmann. How are you, Kelsey?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing well. I'm doing well. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. Just to start off, I found your Instagram account and how you were talking about specific mental health subjects, specifically narcissism and trauma and relationship dependency. And so I'm so glad that you accepted the invitation to come on the podcast because I know that the audience would actually benefit from this conversation. Do you mind sharing a little bit about yourself for the audience?
Yeah, so my name is Kelsey Straatmann, and I right now am a personal trainer with a master's in social psychology. I'm getting my master's in clinical mental health, focusing on relationships, narcissism, and codependent type of dynamics. And I have had a passion for psychology for 8 years. I've really dove into many different textbooks, just on my own because, I really enjoy those things. It's really a passion of mine. So yeah, I'm from Chicago originally. Now I live in St. Louis. That's about it.
Oh, from Chicago.
Yeah.
What got your passion into psychology?
Honestly, since I was a kid, I always told people when you're a kid, people ask, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said psychologist, but I was always kind of deterred from that because everyone was like, oh, well, you can't really do anything with that or this and that. So finally kind of following my dreams based on personal experiences, based on trying to understand people, why they do what they do, why they behave the way they do. And then just in the fitness world I'm in now, just behaviors as to why someone is successful, why someone isn't. Their relationships have a huge impact on their goals, just as wellness. And it's very interesting to see that dynamic between husband and wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, how those types of relationships impact all of their life and all of their goals. And so I really wanted to be able to help people more than just the physical, which is why I'm going to get my master's.
Well, you're in tremendous shape, I can tell, and I love working out as well. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to work this morning, but that's okay. What I'm really hearing from you is that you are curious about behavioral patterns. You're curious about traits of specific individuals and how they mesh with society factors. And the cool thing about psychics is that there's always so many variables at play we can't see, also known in the scientific world as extraneous variables. And I really love that about psych. But today, and maybe we can actually dive in deeper some other time on this, Kelsey, but today I really wanted to take the opportunity since you were on, and I know your passion is narcissism, personality disorder, and I really wanted to talk about that subject. And so I kind of because I didn't want to steal definitions from the DSM, that would be boring. I kind of wrote my own definition, and I wanted to see, and we'll start off there as to what you think narcissism, if this definition I wrote down right here on the Psych Life platform is something that you agree with, or what would you add or take off? And here we go. One of the several types of personality disorders is a mental health condition in which people have an inflated sense of their own importance, need for excessive attention and admiration, troubled relationships, and a lack of empathy for others, depending on the cultural norms in which they belong. So what do you think about this definition about the inflated sense of self-importance and a deep need for excessive attention in the culture that they belong? They're going outside the boundaries of the norms of their society. Would you add or take away anything from this definition?
I completely agree with that definition because a lot of cultural experiences vary on how different cultures would define narcissism based on if they're more independent, based on if they're more collective. And so I love that you added that cultural aspect into it. And I agree. Sometimes it can be more about the inflated self based on a traumatic experience, based on a narcissistic mother, father. There's so many things that impact that. So I love their definition. I think it's great.
You mentioned impact, and so I'm just going to take the opportunity to share with the audience some of the statistics involved with narcissism for example, it's more prevalent in males, and to the general population, about 18%, they say about 18% of individuals can possibly, depending on the therapist, fit within the category of narcissism personality disorder, while only 6% females, which I have to be honest, I don't know if because this is from the 2019 World Health Organization, which I found to be a little bit out there, because I remember when I was going to school, and I'm 30 now. When I was going to school, I could have sworn it was actually the females were more prevalent to being diagnosed with narcissism personality disorder. And does that statistic catch you by surprise?
I'm not surprised by that, but at the same time, it could depend, again, like you said, culturally, but it could also depend on what region you're in. It could depend, like even just in the United States, different areas. It could depend what decade you're looking at, because there's so many different roles that women play versus men play, and how they were raised. Each generation is raised so differently that, if you have our parents or our grandparents that were raised in that era, that women are the caretakers, women are the ones that are running everything. So in that era, you may have men being more narcissistic, or to your point, you could have the housewife that kind of is or feels that she's always taking care of others and wants attention for herself. So I think it probably depends on many different variables and extraneous variables on and where the study is conducted and what demographic and all of that. But
yeah, I love how you brought that up, by the way, Kelsey. I appreciate that, and putting that in my awareness, and it's not something that I don't know, but we all need reminders sometimes that it depends actually what era and what decade and the role the person has, and depending on their gender, their sex, or what's going on in society at that time economically. So I guess you really broke it down there. Now, those diagnosed with narcissism report being happier than other members of society, which is somewhat understandable, because our deepest issues and the things that is sometimes we have difficulty in accepting about ourselves, they cloak themselves from us in every situation, because it's underlying, it's unconscious. And the narcissist, or the one that's experiencing those symptoms, will never notice, like, hey, I'm a narcissist and I'm just being grandiose right now. It's all about me. They're never gonna realize that. And that's kind of part of the definition, where they lack empathy for others. They tend to be highly materialistic, self-enhancing, entitled, impulsive, may not want to learn from mistakes, and typically more trouble with the law. And a lot of times, these issues that they have result in issues like you mentioned earlier, at home, in their relationships, at school, and at work. Now, sometimes in psychology, and especially in the DSM, a lot of people don't realize, but each diagnosis is just a set of criteria someone meets. I've had people, they're happy, and then all of a sudden there's something that happens in their relationship, and they'll say, I'm depressed. And really, they're just sad for 2 or 3 days. And then when I see them get back up and they say, I'm not depressed anymore, I told them, you never had depression, because you only were sad for like 2 or 3 days. And depression is a serious clinical diagnosis, where you have to meet a certain array of criteria, and specifically depression, for at least 2 weeks, and meet a certain array of criteria. Now, the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, I was looking it up, and it's kind of very general. And I always have to remind people that just because you feel like you meet the criteria doesn't necessarily mean so. It actually depends a lot on the therapist. Have you seen, maybe I gave too much information there. What are your thoughts on this?
No, I agree. I mean, people have to realize that, certain diagnoses are not only for clinicians to be able to talk to each other and be able to identify, certain people's problems without actually telling about certain people's problems, but especially when it comes to narcissism being so broad, someone who may be having a day where they're feeling a little more selfish or acting a little more selfish doesn't mean that they're a narcissist, you know? And so by having a broader scope of narcissism, I feel breaks it down into if someone has a true narcissistic disorder or if they just have a narcissistic disorder type. And that again that broadness could also determine where the narcissism came from. You know, so if someone is more just a narcissistic type, they may have they may have been more neglected, maybe growing up, but didn't necessarily have that narcissistic parent, but they may have had a parent that was working all the time and they didn't get the needs met that they needed. And so therefore they became more narcissistic over time. Whereas someone who's maybe narcissistic disorder, they may have been raised by a narcissistic parent, also not meeting those needs, but that constant reinforcement of narcissism, you know, then they're kind of taught that. And so, I mean, I like the broadness that narcissism has in terms of like the DSM, because it then opens up for interpretation as to how that person became that way.
And now I'm going a little way away from the subject, but I really appreciate you sharing that and the ending that you gave there. It gives kind of the clinician the ability to make their own assessment based on what we originally talked about, the cultural background and the norms of society. But at the same time, our profession sometimes gets misused. You know, I'm the host of Psych Life Podcast now, but in my profession, deep professional life, when I see my clients, I'm a mental health counselor. Sometimes I'm seeing that diagnoses are being misused, or actually it's not that they're being misused, it's actually they're being used deliberately to attack people's characters and stuff. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword when we say, oh, we like it open-ended, yeah, because we have good intentions as clinicians, but there's a lot of people out there who don't, and they'll sell themselves out for a moment for whatever their motive is. And I have to be careful what I say, because for some reason we're living in a cancel culture world right now, and I'm not scared to talk about that stuff. But on a side note, just so the audience knows, for narcissistic personality disorder, in the DSM, you have to actually meet 5 out of 9 symptoms, and it was, some of them were in the basic definition I gave, but there was some that I didn't mention, like resentment of others or conviction that others are resentful to him or her, despite there being a lack of evidence, or a display of egotistical and concealed behaviors or attitudes. So it is broad, and as clinicians, we always have to be assessing and take into account the cultural norms involved. Now, one of the cool things that people don't know, Kelsey, about narcissistic personality disorder is how it came about. And it was actually first identified as a disorder in 1898 by Havelock Ellis. And it was featured in subsequent psychological models. And of course, Freud, he wrote a book on it called Freud of Narcissism. And I've never read the book. Have you?
No, I have not read the book, but just learning about Freudism in itself is, you know.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, sorry for the space. Yeah.
I apologize. I thought you were going to say something else. Him as in itself is just so impactful in terms of how he just defines that early childhood experience. So just those different stages in which people can land at and how they can stay there over time.
We get so focused on the definition sometimes, but narcissism is a disorder where the person is having trouble functioning in society because of their way of being. And we understood that sometimes we can see that in individuals, but it wasn't until 1968, and this is again for the audience, that it was put into the DSM. And of course, with the help of the American Psychological Association. And as we talked about earlier, it's considered a problem for relationships with self and others, maintaining a functional culture and way of being. Now, just to go a little bit off this topic, you mentioned codependency and how sometimes someone that's struggling with narcissism personality disorder, and it's not a lifelong trait in my opinion, but some have talked about it in peer reviews that it is. They struggle in their relationships and they're codependent with their partner in such an unhealthy manner. Can you share how that looks like?
Yeah. So what I found in terms of narcissistic and codependency, someone who recognizes and accepts that they have this narcissistic issue and wants to correct it, they kind of can overcorrect sometimes, and that they want to still be in control, but they want to solve other people's problems. They have this need to be needed. And just as narcissism, they want all of the attention and they want the control. Codependency is similar in the sense that, again, maintaining that control and wanting the attention, but they're using that attention thinking they're using that intention for good instead of just to fulfill their ego.
If someone is always wants control in a relationship, that doesn't automatically put them under the umbrella of narcissistic personality disorder. Okay. I'm sharing this obviously for the audience because a lot of times these terms they get thrown out there and people don't really have a deep understanding. But narcissistic personality disorder is an accumulation of all the criteria you and I are bouncing around back and forth. But you know what, I was looking at different diagnoses before this interview, and some of them there was two diagnoses in specific that caught my attention, which was antisocial personality disorder and histrionic personality disorder, which histrionic is like you're very open with not open with your sexuality, but you're showing at a lot of parts and trying to be out there. Maybe I'm a little lost for words this morning. I'm not finding the right word for that, but what would you consider is the main difference between antisocial personality disorder, which is another disorder that the person lacks empathy, they lack somewhat of a remorse, with narcissistic personality disorder? What would you say is the main difference?
I would say that, you kind of hit the nail on the head right there. Empathy is huge, and someone with an antisocial personality disorder truly does lack the empathy aspect of just human connection. Whereas narcissism, someone who has narcissistic personality disorder, does not necessarily lack empathy altogether. They can feel empathy and see empathy and even emulate empathy. But again, to what you said before, narcissistic personality disorder is not an end-all trait, or at least I don't believe that it's an end-all trait. I agree with you on that. But I feel like antisocial personality disorder is more, or appears more, to be long-lasting because of that lack of empathy and that lack of connection to others.
And they also, and I was going to throw this, and it also, someone that's diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder also doesn't have these grandiose, that I'm all this admiration type. It's also, it's more for the lack of empathy that person has with someone else. There is one more diagnosis that sometimes I've even had trouble as a clinician differentiating between the two, which is borderline personality disorder. And a lot of people don't know this, but I've talked about this in the other podcast, which, by the way, if you're listening, just check it out. It's actually from season 1 when we talked about various personality disorders. But borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder, they get interchanged a lot. And just for a quick summary for the audience, the bipolar disorder is, there's multiple, bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and psychosomatic disorder. It depends on every couple of weeks, your personality somewhat changes. The mood that you experience changes. The type of thoughts you have changes. But borderline personality disorder is actually an erratic emotional response on a day-to-day basis, moment-to-moment basis. So when people say, "Oh, you're bipolar," and obviously they're using clinical terms, and I dislike that, and I hold my tongue when they do that because but they're misusing these terms. It's actually, that person's actually catering more towards borderline personality disorder than bipolar personality disorder. But borderline personality disorder and narcissism narcissistic personality disorder, they share a lot of common traits. In fact, if we were to get a chart, and I may create it just to put it on YouTube for everybody, and we were to grab it and we were to look at the two columns and or Venn diagram, we would see that there's a lot of shared traits there in the middle. But just for the audience to know, and I'll let you touch on it again, the grandiose, the need for constant admiration, the need for constant getting more credit than what has been put out, that is a key indicator of the difference between narcissistic personality disorder and the other two personality disorders that we've talked about. But I could be missing something. Would you like to add something there, Kelsey?
No, I think you hit it on the head. And I love the comparison that you're making of the, not the bipolar, but the borderline personality disorder and the narcissism, because they do show a lot of things in common there. And those grand gestures, just being grandiose in personality and this and that, can be mistaken sometimes for narcissistic versus the borderline personality. And I would just say that I think the line there would be, again, the uncontrolled emotions from, minute to minute, even with the borderline personality disorder versus the narcissism, which can be a little bit more controlled. But again, very similar in the different columns and the different aspects in which they are similar.
Yeah. And by the way, I really appreciate being on the podcast and jumping back and forth. Okay.
No, I haven't. Thank you again for inviting me.
So there's two main schools of thoughts when it comes to actually providing psychotherapy services to narcissistic personality disorder. First is the Kernberg school of thought, which is a very, very old school thought, basically uses a reality therapy approach, which is fancy, again, for kind of like a direct confrontation approach, challenging the person, saying that, hey, you're messing up. Hey, what you're doing, and it's almost a CBT approach as well. You say that you deserve all this credit and for what you've done and how you're this great person, but like, what are you actually doing? And it's almost like a CBT approach. Okay, like, what are you doing to want to get this credit? And you're pointing out the flaws and confronting them. And this is kind of an old school thought, and it's considered old school because for the audience out there, because it used to be very, very more direct, but now they add a CBT approach by, instead of just saying you're wrong, you're kind of pointing out the discrepancies between what they're saying and what they're doing. Have you used this type of approach in your internship or with your clients that you work with?
Yeah, a little bit. It's, where I feel that it's important when you're going to criticize someone or constructively criticize someone or tell them they're doing something wrong, that you need to point out not necessarily their flaws or their mistakes, but showing them why you feel that way and explaining to them you want this credit for doing this. Show me where you deserve this. Show me why this credit belongs to you. And just, again, making them realize that, oh, well, maybe I need to do more of XYZ in order to actually take credit for this. And how people approach it, and again, with tone of voice and just the tactics based on what state each individual is as they're being confronted, is huge. And so when we use this approach, it needs to be done tactfully, because otherwise it can just set someone into a rage and in a complete defensive position where they feel more validated because they feel attacked, so.
And the goal of this specific Kernberg school of thought and reality therapy, CBT, they have these terms in the psych field, call it, but the goal is actually eliminating their grandiose, like we said, grandiose thoughts, this high sense of self-admiration that they feel they deserve, and obviously goes into their relationships, like, oh, you're not doing this for me, I deserve this, I deserve flowers every day. And it's almost like it's a whole way of being, and it's right. Challenging their paradigm, really challenging their paradigm in a direct manner, and for the person to realize, hey, you know what? Maybe I really don't deserve some of the things that I'm saying I deserve. And that's why sometimes I I was mentioning earlier about the diagnosis because people think it's a life sentence, and it's not. It's not.
Right.
There are neurodevelopmental disorders that will be somewhat of a hindrance in the long term chronically, but some of these, it's just for a specific period of time you're meeting this criteria in the DSM. And I always remind people that, and my clients, that, because if not, they'll go around saying I have this, and it's almost like now they're identifying with that. So
Right.
the second school of thought, and we talked about Kernberg, direct confrontation, almost eliminating the patient's grandiosity. That's the goal. But the second is cool hope, which is, I remember in grad school a couple years ago, I didn't understand this approach that much, but it's actually being more empathetic towards the client that encourages the client's grandiosity to strengthen the patient's natural deficient self. So basically what that means is, oh yeah, you're encouraging them, saying, oh, you are special, you are this, you are all these things. Okay, so what? Like, you are special, you do deserve this admiration, but so does everybody else. Kind of almost like they're not so different from everybody, like the way they're making it seem. I don't really find that approach 100%. Like I don't see myself, and even me with my clients, using that approach 100%. But what do you think about that approach? And it's a little odd.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm more prone to the Kernberg approach, but I can see how with certain people that this approach may work, because when you have someone who challenging why they deserve these recognitions, whatever, when that doesn't work, if they, let's say, do become defensive and you're trying to show them, this theory may work in the sense that if you are encouraging them, but that at the same time, but then also bring to light that, well, this person is also awesome or deserves this, and this person, so kind of may actually have them try to actually participate more, do more in society for others, in that sense. So I can see how it would work, but at the same time, I think it also determines who you're working with. It's all based on where their, again, the cultural upbringing, maybe their environment. I think cultural environment has a lot to do with which theories that we as clinicians or therapists should choose to fit each client. And that's one thing that I love just about all of this, is there's so many different ways and approaches to help somebody in their journey.
And the cultural part, and we must always take that into consideration, because the DSM doesn't, they've been trying to include culture, especially in this recent revision they did, but they actually leave that up to the clinician. And that's why they've been focusing for a while now on for clinicians to be multicultural, educated, and understanding this. So I'm glad you brought that up. There is something that maybe we should finish on, and the comorbid involved with narcissistic personality disorder. And you mentioned subtypes, but we're going to go a little bit more on the surface this time. And about 45 to 50% of those diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder will experience some of the symptoms of depression. And at the same time, approximately about 24 to 64%, this is straight out of the World Health Organization, by the way, will experience some sort of substance use disorder. Now, we talked and we differentiated between narcissism and, borderline personality and antisocial. Why, obviously we need a way more research to actually go in depth on some of these topics. But why do you think it is, though, that, especially with the substance use, why would someone that would struggling with the criteria men in the DSM with narcissistic personality disorder, why do you think they would struggle with substance use? And actually, substance use is a field I've been working in for a while, and it kind of caught me by surprise, believe it or not.
So to me, it seems likely, and doesn't surprise me necessarily, that someone with any form of narcissistic or borderline personality disorder may end up with using substance abuse or would also be clarified as depressed in certain circumstances, because in a certain way, these people get to this point or are diagnosed with these things because at some point in their life, early on, their needs generally aren't met, according to research, and these things form, so to speak. They're not necessarily born this way. And so over time, when their needs aren't being met, if the narcissist or borderline personality disorder person is struggling with meeting their own needs, and all of these grand gestures, being grandiose, and all this attention is still not fulfilling those needs, I can see how you turning to substance abuse or being depressed because they don't know how to feel the way they want to feel. They want to feel like they are being admired. They want to feel like they are loved, but all the attention doesn't necessarily bring that. They're missing those key components like empathy, that when you empathize with somebody, you make that connection and you have a sense of understanding. And these people who unfortunately suffer from these things don't have that or lack that in certain ways, and wish that they could understand in certain circumstances. There are plenty of narcissistic personality disorders out there who have no interest in others, again, because of the lack of empathy, but there are plenty that do want to be better and do want to do better, but don't know how and have a hard time. I mean, everybody this day and age has, I feel, an issue asking for help sometimes. And I think that it is getting better, but you still, again, have those cultures that you don't turn to someone for help. You don't seek out help from a psychologist to work on your problems or work on yourself. And I think that is a big hindrance with some people as to why they would turn to substance abuse, or why they suffer from depression in the first place.
I think that's a good point. If you're having trouble getting the admiration someone thinks they deserve and this distortion that they have, then I can see why they would turn to substances. It's just more the statistic that surprised me when it said right now 24 to 64% of those diagnosed. That was actually a big one, and that actually took me by surprise. So you mentioned culture there for a moment, and a big part of it, and we can end this podcast on this note. I want to hear your feedback on it and your closing remarks as well. But I think the big thing now is that's changing a little bit. The stigma surrounding therapy, the stigma surrounding counseling, and I see it more with my clients because I've been in the field now since I was doing ABA therapy before that, but anyways, in the mental health field for a while, since 2015. And I'm seeing actually the sentiment in the communities change a little bit regarding counseling, because I work with high-risk youth. So I really go and get my hands dirty with the youth and help them get jobs or whatever the counseling and they need at that moment. I'll do it. And I'm seeing the sentiment change regarding in the community regarding counseling. But the biggest issue is the lack of resources they have. And a lot of people don't understand that there's free resources out there, government funded. And I know non-for-profit agencies, like once you get involved, at least in a big city like Miami, and I'm assuming Chicago, from where you're from originally, was also somewhat like that, where there's a lot of resources at play. You just got to find them. You got to want them. And but it's true. There still is a huge stigma surrounding counseling, and a lot of these disorders, like there's not enough education surrounding them, so people misuse it. Like we gave the example, you're bipolar because you're always like, they're not using those terms properly. And since they're not using those terms properly, there's a lot of misconceptions in the field still in mental health. And I think you do a great job of helping destigmatize some of the subject. I saw some of your own content, and I appreciate you coming on the platform today to help destigmatize the subject surrounding narcissistic personality disorder.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me again. I think that I agree. There's so many disorders like narcissistic disorder and bipolar and borderline personality that there's such a stigma that people don't understand. And, with all the information that we have with the internet and social media, and people are now trying to be experts without the actual education behind it. And again, like you said, calling themselves this or that. And it's like you're throwing that term around, and people don't realize that the people who have these disorders were once hurt as well. You know what I mean? They weren't born that way. You know, they somehow their experiences or whatever, they became that way. And so it's hard because there's just such stigma around it, and I could go on forever. So
like the movie The Joker, right?
Right, exactly.
I don't know if you saw that movie. I'm just kidding.
I did.
Oh, you did, yeah.
What you're talking about, right?
I just saw it recently, that's why. So do you want to share with the audience where they can find you? Share your Instagram. I'm gonna obviously put it on the bottom of the caption just so everybody knows, or anything that you want to share where they can find you.
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram and TikTok at KP_Straatmann. There's 2 A's, 2 N's. And yeah, come follow me, and you'll learn a lot about many different psychological theories. But again, I focus more on narcissism, codependency, that type of relationship, how to recover from codependency, and how to recognize narcissistic traits, and also how to reduce anxiety in those types of situations from both a narcissistic and a codependency standpoint. So
if you guys want to follow Kelsey Straatmann on TikTok or Instagram, I'm going to put the links down below in the caption. If you're looking on YouTube, if you're on Spotify, I will just put how to spell it out, since they don't allow for links for everybody out there that does want to check her out. And I really appreciate you, Kelsey, and I appreciate the Psych Life audience out there. I really appreciate the support. And thank you so much. Okay. Take care.
Thank you so much. Take care.